The quantum coffee maker in conference room 7 had been making that peculiar whirring sound for 3 days now, and Commander Jake Sullivan was beginning to suspect it might achieve sentience before these negotiations concluded. He stared at the innocuous device as it gurgled through another brewing cycle, wondering if caffeinated artificial intelligence would be more reasonable than the diplomatic delegates currently assembling around the polished titanium table. "Sir, the Zephyrian delegation has docked," Lieutenant Morrison announced from the doorway, her voice carrying that particular blend of professionalism and barely concealed anxiety that Sullivan had come to associate with career-defining moments. "Princess Lyreley is requesting a 5-minute delay to, and I quote, ensure her translator hasn't been corrupted by human linguistic peculiarities." Sullivan suppressed a snort. 3 months of preparation, 17 different security briefings, and enough red tape to gift-wrap a space station, all leading to this moment. The fate of human expansion into the outer rim systems hung in the balance, and their counterpart was worried about linguistic corruption. Tell her she can have 10 minutes if she needs it. Better safe than accidentally declaring war because the translator thinks territorial concession means ritualistic dance-off. The lieutenant's mouth twitched. "Should I mention the dance-off possibility in my report, sir?" "Only if you want to explain to Admiral Reyes why our first contact protocols now include choreography requirements." Sullivan stood and smoothed his dress uniform, noting how the recycled air aboard the diplomatic vessel Concordia still carried that metallic tang that reminded him of old battleships. Some things never changed, whether you were fighting aliens or negotiating with them. The Concordia itself was a marvel of neutral engineering, built jointly by 5 different species specifically for situations like this. Every surface was designed to be culturally inoffensive, every room temperature controlled to accommodate various physiologies, and every meal synthesizer programmed with dietary restrictions that read like a xenobiologist's fever dream. Sullivan had been living aboard for 2 weeks now, and he still couldn't figure out why the bathroom fixtures assumed he had tentacles. "Commander," came another voice from the corridor. "Doctor." Sarah Kim, the expedition's chief xenopsychologist, entered with her arms full of data tablets and what appeared to be a small potted plant. "Last-minute intelligence update. Princess Lyreley scored in the 97th percentile on strategic thinking assessments, speaks 14 languages including 3 dead ones, and apparently once negotiated a trade agreement by challenging her counterpart to a poetry contest." "Poetry?" Sullivan raised an eyebrow. "Please tell me that's not going to be our fallback strategy." "Only if you're confident in your iambic pentameter." Kim set the plant on the table with unnecessary ceremony. "This is a Terran peace lily. Diplomatic protocol suggests that organic gifts demonstrate goodwill and, oh, who am I kidding? Morrison dared me to see if I could sneak a houseplant into an interstellar peace summit." "Dr. Kim, you have a Ph.D. in xenopsychology from Cambridge, which apparently doesn't prevent me from accepting dares involving flora." She grinned unrepentantly. "The plant stays. If nothing else, it'll give us something to talk about when the conversation inevitably turns to the 17 border incidents that nearly started a war." Sullivan found himself almost smiling despite the circumstances. Kim had been his psychological advisor for 3 years now, ever since the incident at Proxima Station, and her ability to find humor in the most dire situations had probably prevented him from developing at least 6 different stress disorders. "Just promise me you won't start discussing photosynthesis when we're trying to negotiate mining rights." "I make no such promises. Did you know that Zephyrian plant biology operates on completely different principles than—" "Dr. Kim, right, saving the botany lecture for the reception dinner." She consulted her tablet. "Speaking of which, their dietary requirements are fascinating. Apparently, they can't process synthetic proteins, which means all their food has to be naturally grown. Do you have any idea what that costs in shipping alone?" Before Sullivan could respond, the conference room's main display flickered to life, showing the external view of space around the Concordia. Against the star field, a sleek vessel approached with the fluid grace of something that had never been designed by committee. The Zephyrian diplomatic ship Whispered Harmony looked more like a work of art than a spacecraft, its bioluminescent hull panels pulsing in slow, hypnotic patterns. "Show-offs," muttered Lieutenant Morrison. "It's actually quite practical," Kim observed. "The bioluminescence isn't decorative, it's a complex communication system. Those patterns are probably transmitting their diplomatic credentials, security clearances, and possibly their lunch preferences." "What's it saying right now?" Sullivan asked, watching the mesmerizing light display. Kim squinted at the ship. "Either we come in peace, or your docking bay smells funny. Xenolinguistics isn't an exact science." The airlock's proximity sensors chimed, indicating successful docking. Sullivan felt his stomach tighten, not from nerves exactly, but from the familiar pre-mission awareness that had kept him alive through 15 years of military service. This wasn't a battlefield, but the stakes were arguably higher. One wrong word, one misinterpreted gesture, and the fragile ceasefire that had held for 6 months would shatter like crystal in vacuum. "Places, everyone," he announced, though the only people in the room were Kim, Morrison, and a security officer who looked like he'd rather be wrestling plasma conduits than monitoring diplomatic small talk. "Remember, we're representing all of humanity here, so let's try not to accidentally insult their ancestors or declare war on their houseplants." "What if they declare war on our houseplant?" Kim gestured to the peace lily. "Then we negotiate a separate treaty with the plant." The conference room doors slid open with a whisper of recycled air, and Sullivan's first glimpse of Princess Lyreley made him understand why the Zephyrian Empire had chosen her as their primary negotiator. She moved with the kind of fluid confidence that suggested she'd never encountered a problem she couldn't solve, whether through diplomacy, strategy, or sheer force of personality. Her appearance was remarkably human-like, so much so that, if not for the elegantly pointed ears that swept back from her temples, she could have passed for a particularly striking human diplomat. Her entourage followed in formation. 2 advisors whose expressions suggested they'd rather be anywhere else in the galaxy. A security chief who made Sullivan's own guard look relaxed by comparison, and what appeared to be a protocol droid that kept making small adjustment to everyone's positions like a neurotic choreographer. "Commander Sullivan," Princess Lyreley's voice carried a slight accent that made even formal greetings sound like poetry. "I trust your accommodations aboard this architecturally adventurous vessel have been satisfactory." Sullivan caught the subtle diplomatic insult wrapped in courtesy. The Concordia was indeed an aesthetic nightmare, form following function with all the artistic sensibility of a military contractor's fever dream. "Princess Lyreley, welcome aboard. The accommodations are quite functional, which I've learned to appreciate more than beauty in my line of work." How pragmatic. Her violet eyes held what might have been amusement. "I suppose when one spends one's career in the business of controlled violence, aesthetics become secondary to survival." And there it was, the first verbal thrust, delivered with such elegance that it took Sullivan a moment to realize she just called him a professional killer. "In my experience, Your Highness, survival often depends on appreciating the beauty in simple things, like successful negotiations that prevent people from shooting at each other." How charmingly optimistic. She took her seat with practiced grace, her diplomatic robes shifting color slightly in response to the room's lighting. "Shall we begin with the customary exchange of pleasantries, or would you prefer to proceed directly to the part where we politely threaten each other's star systems?" Dr. Kim coughed softly. "Perhaps we could start with introductions, and possibly discuss the plan." The holographic star map flickered between human and Zephyrian territorial claims like a cosmic game of chess, played by caffeinated gods. Princess Lyreley, manipulated the display with graceful finger movements, each gesture highlighting another disputed system, while she maintained the kind of serene expression usually reserved for people who knew exactly how to dismantle their opponents without breaking a sweat. "The Kepler 442 system," she began, her voice carrying the patient tone of someone explaining basic mathematics to a particularly slow child, "has been under Zephyrian jurisdiction for approximately— how do you measure time again? Ah yes, 37 of your Earth years. We've established mining operations, research stations, and what you might call a significant emotional attachment to the local asteroid belts." Sullivan studied the hologram, noting how the Zephyrian territorial boundaries seemed to expand every time she adjusted the display. "Emotional attachment to asteroid belts, that's a new one. Do you also have feelings about cosmic dust clouds and gas giants? Commander, you underestimate the depth of Zephyrian spirituality. We believe every celestial body has what you might call a personality." Lyralay's eyes held a mischievous glint. "For instance, that particular asteroid belt is quite moody. It tends to explode unexpectedly when approached by unauthorized mining vessels." "How remarkably convenient for your territorial claims." Sullivan leaned back in his chair, which had been ergonomically designed by someone who clearly had never met a human spine. "I suppose the asteroids told you they prefer Zephyrian mining techniques." "Actually, yes. Our geological surveys are conducted through a process we call mineral empathy. We commune with the rock formations to understand their optimal extraction preferences." She paused, watching his expression. "I'm joking, Commander. We use the same sonic resonance scanners as everyone else. Though I must admit, your face just now was quite entertaining." Dr. Kim chuckled from her position near the Peace Lily, which had somehow acquired a small audience of curious Zephyrian advisors. "Princess, I have to ask, do all Zephyrian diplomatic strategies involve psychological manipulation through elaborate mineral spirituality jokes?" "Only on days ending in Y, Dr. Kim. On other days, we resort to interpretive dance and threatening to withdraw our trade agreements." Lyralay gestured to the hologram again, this time highlighting a cluster of systems near the edge of human space. "Now, regarding the Proxima Centauri mining consortium." Sullivan's jaw tightened at the mention of Proxima. 3 years, and the memory still felt like a fresh plasma burn. "The Proxima incident was resolved through existing diplomatic channels. I fail to see how it's relevant to current negotiations." "Oh, but it's extraordinarily relevant." Lyralay's tone remained conversational, but something predatory flickered in her violet eyes. 17 human miners died when your extraction ship suffered what your reports called catastrophic decompression due to equipment failure. Tragic, certainly, but our long-range sensors detected a very different story." The conference room fell silent except for the quantum coffee maker, which chose that moment to emit a sound remarkably similar to nervous laughter. Lieutenant Morrison's hand moved unconsciously toward her sidearm before she caught herself and pretended to adjust her tablet instead. "Equipment failures happen," Sullivan said carefully. "Mining is dangerous work." "Indeed it is. Especially when that equipment failure coincidentally occurs 3 hours after the miners discovered what appeared to be pre-existing excavation sites. Sites that bore remarkable similarity to Zephyrian archaeological markers." Lyralay leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, Commander, what's your policy on interfering with active archaeological research?" Dr. Kim cleared her throat diplomatically. "Perhaps we could focus on current territorial agreements rather than past incidents. The Peace Lily seems to think we're spending too much time on historical grievances." "The plant has opinions now?" asked one of the Zephyrian advisors, a tall individual whose pointed ears twitched with what might have been amusement. "Dr. Kim has a unique relationship with Flora," Sullivan explained, grateful for the momentary diversion. "She believes plants are excellent judges of diplomatic progress, something about their oxygen production fluctuating with stress levels in the room. Fascinating. Lyrale studied the lily with genuine curiosity. And what does your botanical consultant suggest about our current negotiations? Kim glanced at the plant, then at the increasingly tense faces around the table. Well, it's looking a bit droopy, which either means we need to lower the room temperature or someone's about to make a spectacularly bad diplomatic decision. How refreshingly honest. Lyrale's smile was sharp enough to cut titanium. Commander, shall we make that spectacularly bad decision now, or would you prefer to warm up with some smaller diplomatic failures first? The holographic display suddenly erupted with proximity alarms as the room's automated systems detected an incoming transmission. The star map dissolved, replaced by the concerned face of Admiral Reyes broadcasting from Earth Command. Commander Sullivan, we're receiving reports of increased Zephyrian military activity near the Vega system. Can you confirm whether this is related to your current negotiations? Sullivan felt every eye in the room turn toward him. Princess Lyrale's expression remained perfectly neutral, but her fingers had stopped moving and were now resting flat against the table surface. A gesture he was beginning to recognize as her version of drawing weapons. Admiral, we're in active negotiations. Any military movements would be. He glanced at Lyrale, who gave him a smile that could have powered a small fusion reactor. Training exercises, she said smoothly. Routine maneuvers designed to test our new gravitational anchor systems. Surely Admiral Reyes doesn't object to military preparedness. The Admiral's face took on the expression of someone trying to solve a particularly complex equation while underwater. Princess Lyrale, I wasn't aware you were monitoring our communication channels. I'm not monitoring anything, Admiral. I'm simply participating in a conversation that's being broadcast to the entire conference room. Her tone carried the innocent quality of someone explaining why water was wet. Unless you intended this to be a private military briefing, because that would constitute a rather significant breach of diplomatic protocol. Sullivan watched the Admiral's face cycle through several different shades of frustration before settling on diplomatic resignation. Of course not, Princess. Commander, please continue with the negotiations. And perhaps someone could explain why there's a house plan in your briefing. That's classified, sir, Kim interjected helpfully. Botanical security protocols. The transmission ended with Admiral Reyes looking like he'd rather be commanding a fleet engagement than dealing with interstellar diplomacy. The holographic star map reappeared, but now it showed new data, real-time military positions that made the disputed territories look like a cosmic minefield. Well, Lyrale said pleasantly, that was educational. Shall we discuss those training exercises, Commander? Or would you prefer to address the 17 reconnaissance drones your fleet positioned near our outer defense perimeter this morning? Sullivan stared at the display, counting at least 12 human vessels that definitely hadn't been there during his last briefing. Princess, I think we need to have a more direct conversation. Finally, she stood with fluid grace, her diplomatic robes shifting from diplomatic blue to something that looked remarkably like warning amber. Dr. Kim, would you mind watching the plant? I suspect we're about to discover just how accurate its stress level predictions really are. The emergency klaxon chose the worst possible moment to announce that someone somewhere was having a spectacularly bad day. Sullivan's coffee mug, the one with Galaxy's okayest negotiator, printed in fading letters, rattled against the conference table as red warning lights bathed the room in an apocalyptic glow that made everyone look either terrifying or slightly nauseous. Well, Princess Lyrale observed with the kind of calm usually reserved for people discussing weather patterns rather than potential interstellar incidents. This is either a very elaborate simulation designed to test our diplomatic resolve, or someone has managed to catastrophically mismanage basic space traffic control. Lieutenant Morrison's voice crackled through the comm system with a particular strain that indicated she was reading from a report she really didn't want to be delivering. "Commander, we have a developing situation. The cargo freighter Lucky Strike has suffered what appears to be a complete navigation system failure approximately 40,000 kilometers from our current position. They're broadcasting distress signals on all frequencies and, sir." "What is it, Lieutenant?" "They're also broadcasting what appears to be a recipe for something called Grandma Patterson's famous antimatter cookies on the emergency channel. The translator is having some difficulty determining whether this is code, a cry for help, or genuine culinary advice." Princess Lyralay's eyebrows, elegantly arched and perfectly symmetrical in the way that suggested either excellent genetics or very dedicated grooming, rose in what might have been amusement. "Commander, your species continues to fascinate me. Even in crisis, you share baking instructions." "It's probably a malfunction in their communication array," Sullivan said, though privately he wasn't entirely certain. Human emergency protocols had evolved in ways that sometimes defied logical explanation. "Lieutenant, what's their current trajectory?" "That's the problem, sir. They don't have one. Their momentum is carrying them directly toward the Kepler 442 system, and at current velocity, they'll reach Zephyrian territorial space in approximately 14 hours. The conference room fell silent except for the quantum coffee maker, which had apparently decided this was an excellent time to begin what sounded like a mechanical interpretation of funeral music. "Doctor." Kim moved protectively closer to the peace lily, which was indeed looking droopy in a way that suggested either poor lighting or impending diplomatic catastrophe. 14 hours, Lyralay repeated thoughtfully. Just enough time for the situation to become significantly more complicated than anyone involved would prefer. She touched something on her wrist that projected a small holographic display showing the freighter's projected course. "Commander, I trust you understand that any unauthorized vessel entering our territorial space during active military exercises will be treated as, well, let's call it an opportunity for live-fire training. Princess, surely you're not suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating established Zephyrian defense protocol with the clarity of someone who would rather not explain to her military commanders why she allowed an unknown human vessel to drift into our most sensitive mining operations." Her violet eyes held a hardness that reminded Sullivan uncomfortably that diplomatic immunity didn't extend to acts of war. "Unless, of course, you'd prefer to handle this through your own rescue operations." Sullivan's mind raced through the tactical possibilities, none of which ended well. Human rescue ships couldn't reach the freighter before it crossed into disputed territory, and any military vessel sent to intercept would look like an aggressive move to Zephyrian forces already on high alert. "What are you proposing?" "A joint rescue operation." Lyralay's smile returned, but it carried the kind of calculation that made experienced negotiators check their pockets for missing items. "Your technical expertise, our territorial access, and a mutual demonstration that both species can cooperate when faced with genuine humanitarian crisis. And if something goes wrong during this joint operation, then we'll blame the antimatter cookies and hope the historical record focuses on our good intentions rather than our execution." She gestured to her advisor, who immediately began manipulating a portable hologram projector. "Dr. Kim, does your botanical consultant have any opinions about rescue missions?" Kim glanced at the peace lily, which was now definitely wilting despite the carefully controlled environment. "It's not looking optimistic. Plants are surprisingly good at detecting when people are about to make decisions that will complicate their lives significantly." "Excellent. Nothing builds character like complicated life decisions." Lyralay studied the holographic display of the drifting freighter. "Commander, The Lucky Strike appears to be a modified cargo hauler with non-standard engine configurations. Your engineers would be more familiar with human modifications, while our gravitational manipulation systems could provide the precise maneuvering needed for safe recovery. The logic was sound, which made Sullivan immediately suspicious. In his experience, when alien princesses offered perfectly reasonable solutions to complex problems, there was usually a catch somewhere in the fine print. What's the catch? Catch? Lyralay's expression was the picture of wounded innocence. Commander, I'm offering a humanitarian gesture designed to save human lives and demonstrate interstellar cooperation. What possible ulterior motive could I have? In my experience, anyone who asks that question usually has at least 3 ulterior motives and a backup plan involving explosives. How refreshingly paranoid. I do appreciate a negotiator who understands the value of healthy suspicion. She leaned forward conspiratorially. Very well. The catch, as you so diplomatically put it, is that this rescue operation would require both our vessels to operate in close proximity within disputed territory. The joint mission would establish a precedent for cooperative operations in the Kepler 442 system. Meaning that if we can successfully work together to save your drifting cookie enthusiasts, it might demonstrate that shared jurisdiction of certain strategic systems is not only possible but beneficial for both species. Her smile was sharp enough to cut through diplomatic immunity. Unless, of course, you'd prefer to let the Lucky Strike drift into our territorial space and become a training target for our new plasma lance systems. Sullivan felt the familiar weight of command decisions settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Save the freighter crew and potentially legitimize Zephyrian claims to disputed territory, or refuse cooperation and watch 17 civilians become casualties of interstellar politics. How do I know this isn't an elaborate setup? Commander, if I wanted to orchestrate an elaborate setup, I would have chosen something significantly more dramatic than a malfunctioning cargo hauler broadcasting baking recipes. Perhaps a mysterious alien artifact or a rogue artificial intelligence with delusions of galactic conquest. Lyralay's eyes held what might have been genuine amusement. Besides, your doctor, Kim's botanical consultant, seems to think cooperation is our best option. The plant told you that. Kim looked up from where she'd been adjusting the lily's position to catch better light from the emergency illumination. Actually, it perked up a bit when the princess mentioned working together. Plants are surprisingly good at detecting when people are being genuine about helping others. Doctor. Kim, you have a doctorate in xenopsychology, not botany. True, but I also have excellent instincts about both aliens and houseplants. She grinned unrepentantly. Besides, what's the worst that could happen? The emergency klaxon chose that moment to sound again, accompanied by Lieutenant Morrison's voice, announcing that the Lucky Strike had just broadcast what appeared to be a shopping list for 17 different types of emergency rations and 1 really good cup of coffee. Well, Princess Lyralay said brightly, I suppose we're about to find out. The docking bay of the Lucky Strike smelled like burned circuitry, recycled air, and what Sullivan could only describe as the lingering ghost of someone's attempt at cooking with antimatter-adjacent ingredients. Emergency lighting cast everything in amber shadows, making the rescue operation look like a scene from a particularly dramatic holodrama. Except real holodrama heroes never had to deal with malfunctioning gravity generators that made everyone walk like they were perpetually falling upward. Careful with that support beam, Princess Lyralay called out, her diplomatic robes traded for practical rescue gear that somehow still managed to make her look like she was posing for the cover of Interstellar Crisis Management Monthly. She worked alongside Sullivan to extract an unconscious crew member from a collapsed section of the cargo hold, her movements precise and efficient despite the artificial gravity that kept shifting between slightly dizzy and carnival ride malfunction. Sullivan couldn't help but notice how naturally they'd fallen into working together, their earlier diplomatic antagonism forgotten in the face of immediate humanitarian need. "Princess, there's something different about this ship. The damage patterns don't match a simple navigation failure. I noticed that too." She paused in her work, studying burn marks on the bulkhead that looked suspiciously deliberate. "These plasma scoring marks suggest weapons fire, not system malfunction. Someone attacked this vessel." The implications hung in the recycled air like a toxic cloud. An attack on a civilian freighter in neutral space would shift the entire diplomatic landscape, potentially justifying military action from both sides. Sullivan felt the familiar weight of decisions that would affect millions of lives settling on his shoulders again. "Commander," came Dr. Kim's voice through the comm system, "we've got survivors coming around in the medical bay, and you're going to want to hear what they have to say about how they ended up here." The medical bay was cramped, poorly lit, and smelled like industrial-strength antiseptic mixed with fierce sweat. 5 crew members sat on makeshift stretchers, their faces bearing the particular expression of people who'd survived something they didn't entirely understand. The captain, a grizzled woman whose left arm was in an improvised sling, looked up as Sullivan and Lyreley entered. "Commander," she said, her voice carrying the rough edge of someone who'd been breathing recycled air for too long, "Captain Martinez of the Lucky Strike. We were transporting archaeological samples from the Beta Cygni dig site when we got jumped by pirates using stolen Zephyrian technology." Sullivan felt Princess Lyreley stiffen beside him. Stolen Zephyrian technology. Plasma lances, gravitational disruptors, the whole package. But here's the strange part. They weren't trying to steal our cargo. They were specifically looking for something called Archaeological Sample XB-47. When we told them we didn't have anything by that designation, they got creative with their interrogation techniques. "Captain Martinez," Lyreley's voice carried a careful neutrality that didn't fool anyone in the room, "can you describe these pirates? Any identifying characteristics? Mixed crew, humans, Zephyrians, even a couple of those blue-skinned folks from the Arcturus system, but their leader." Martinez paused, studying Lyreley's face with growing recognition. "Princess, I think you should know. Their leader was wearing what looked like Zephyrian royal insignia." The silence that followed was broken only by the medical bay's life support systems and what sounded like Dr. Kim muttering something about houseplants being better judges of character than most sentient species. "Royal insignia," Lyreley repeated slowly. "Captain, this is extremely important. Can you describe exactly what you saw?" Martinez nodded toward a storage compartment. "I took pictures before they damaged our recording systems. Figured if we survived, someone would want evidence." The holographic display that materialized above her portable projector showed a figure in modified Zephyrian armor, but what made Sullivan's blood run cold was the face beneath the helmet. Sharp features, pointed ears, and violet eyes that looked remarkably familiar, except where Lyreley's expression held intelligence and humor. This figure radiated cold calculation. "Prince Valdris," Lyreley whispered, and for the first time since Sullivan had met her, she looked genuinely shaken. "My brother." The pieces of the diplomatic puzzle suddenly rearranged themselves into a picture that made Sullivan's head spin. Border incidents, stolen technology, archaeological sites that mysteriously exploded when human miners got too close. It all pointed to a conspiracy designed to sabotage the peace negotiations. "Princess," he said carefully, "is there something you haven't told us about Zephyrian internal politics?" She sank onto a nearby crate, her usual composure cracking to reveal something uncomfortably human underneath. "Valdris has always believed that peace with humanity would weaken the Empire. He's been working to undermine these negotiations from the beginning, but I never suspected he'd resort to piracy and false flag operations." "False flag operations," Sullivan repeated. "The Proxima incident was probably his work, yes. made to look like human mining operations were interfering with our archaeological sites, when in reality he was destroying evidence of pre-war cooperation between our species. She looked up at him with eyes that held a mixture of anger and something that might have been grief. "Commander, I owe you an apology. The aggressive stance I've taken during negotiations. I was trying to compensate for intelligence reports that suggested human forces were becoming increasingly hostile. Reports that were apparently fabricated by my own brother." Captain Martinez cleared her throat diplomatically. "If it helps, Princess, your brother seemed genuinely surprised when we told him our cargo was just regular mining equipment and personal effects. Whatever he was looking for, he expected it to be on our ship specifically." "Archaeological sample XB-47, Sullivan mused. "Princess, does that designation mean anything to you?" Lyralay's expression shifted from confusion to something approaching horror. "It's not a sample designation. It's a date, the 47th day of the Beta cycle, 15 years ago. The day a human rescue ship pulled survivors from a burning Zephyrian transport that had been attacked by pirates in neutral space." The medical bay fell silent, except for the sound of Sullivan's world quietly rearranging itself around a memory he'd spent 15 years trying to forget. A burning ship, emergency lights flashing through smoke, and a terrified child with pointed ears who'd looked at him with violet eyes full of trust as he'd carried her to safety. "Wait," he said slowly, his hand unconsciously moving to touch the faded scar on his left temple, a souvenir from falling debris during that long-ago rescue. "Princess, how old were you 15 years ago?" She stared at him with growing recognition, her fingers trembling as she reached out to trace the edge of his scar. "You were the one who pulled me from the wreckage, the human rescue pilot who wouldn't leave anyone behind, even when the ship's reactor was about to breach. You were just a kid, scared, injured, calling for your parents in a language I didn't understand." Sullivan felt the weight of years shifting, old memories clicking into place like pieces of a puzzle he'd never known he was solving. "I never found out what happened to you after we got you to the medical station. I spent 3 months in recovery, telling anyone who would listen about the human pilot who saved my life. My family thought it was trauma-induced fantasy until the medical records confirmed everything." Tears tracked down her cheeks, but her smile was radiant. "I've been looking for you for 15 years, Jake Sullivan. Every diplomatic posting, every negotiation with human forces. I kept hoping I'd find the man who taught me that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about doing what's right even when you're terrified." "Doctor." Kim's voice broke the emotional silence. "Well, this explains why the peace Lily perked up whenever you two were in the room together. Plants are excellent at detecting unresolved emotional connections." "Doctor." "Kim," Sullivan said without taking his eyes off Lyralay, "for once in your career, your botanical psychology might actually be right." Princess Lyralay laughed, not the controlled diplomatic sound he'd heard during negotiations, but something genuine and joyful that made the cramped medical bay feel less like a disaster zone and more like the place where two old friends had finally found each other again. "So,